I'd never thought of myself as someone who enjoyed the great outdoors, but when my friends persuaded me to join them for a weekend hike at Black Hollow Mountain, I thought it might be a refreshing change. Black Hollow Mountain was known not only for its tough trails, but also for the spooky tales that had been passed down among the locals for years. Some claimed it was cursed, but I was skeptical about those stories. After all, a mountain is simply a mountain, isn't it? We set off early in the morning with the sun just beginning to rise. The air was fresh and a gentle mist wove its way through the tall pine trees at the trailhead. My friends were all filled with enthusiasm, yet there was something in the air that made me feel a bit uneasy. It wasn't just the stillness. There were no birds chirping or animals stirring. It was a heavy sensation, as if unseen eyes were watching us. I tried to dismiss it, attributing it to my own nerves. The hike began quite pleasantly, but it soon became apparent why this location was dubbed Black Hollow Mountain. Regardless of how high we ascended or how far we delved into the woods, an eerie stillness enveloped us as if the outside world had ceased to exist. With each step deeper into the wilderness, my sense of unease intensified. I struggled to keep pace with my friends, and as we climbed higher, my legs felt increasingly burdened, as though an invisible force was pulling me down. After about 3 hours, we stumbled upon a clearing and decided to take a break. That's when the atmosphere shifted. While we were enjoying snacks and chatting, a voice suddenly pierced the silence. Initially faint, it resembled a distant whisper. My friends chuckled, thinking it was merely another group of hikers ahead of us. However, as the voice grew more distinct, we realized it was pleading for assistance. "Help me! Please help!" We all sprang to our feet, scanning the edges of the forest. The voice seemed to emanate from deeper within the trees, away from our path. My heart raced, and every instinct urged me to remain where I was. But one of my friends, Tommy, was adamant that we should investigate. Reluctantly, I found myself following along. As we ventured further into the forest, our voices echoed in the stillness, but there was no reply. The deeper we trekked, the more intense the cry for help became, yet it remained elusive, as if it were intentionally drawing us away from the familiar path. After what seemed like an endless journey, we stumbled upon a sight that sent chills down my spine. In a secluded clearing stood an old, dilapidated cabin, so well concealed by the surrounding trees that we nearly overlooked it. The wood was rotting, the windows were broken, and it appeared abandoned for ages. However, the most unsettling detail was the sign nailed to a nearby tree that read, "Leave while you still can." Tommy, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as a mere joke, but I felt a deep unease. The atmosphere was thick with an eerie coldness, and the shadows appeared to flicker unnaturally. Despite my apprehension, Tommy pressed on toward the cabin, while I hesitated, keeping my distance as a few of our friends reluctantly trailed behind him. As they approached the door, the voice returned. This time it was louder and clearer than before. "Help me! Please, help!" It echoed from within the cabin. Tom halted abruptly, his confident smile vanishing. My heart raced as I observed his moment of uncertainty. Yet in a moment of reckless bravery, he swung the door open. The first thing that assaulted us was a nauseating, rotting odor that made me want to retch. Tommy flinched, instinctively covering his nose, but his curiosity overpowered his better judgment. He stepped inside, calling out for the person in distress. His voice bounced back, eerily hollow. A few moments later, a blood-curdling scream erupted from within. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, raw and filled with dread. We all rushed toward the cabin, but just as we reached the entrance, Tom stumbled out, his complexion ghostly and his eyes wide with terror. He was too shaken to speak, merely pointing inside, his body trembling uncontrollably. I moved forward, defying every instinct urging me to turn back, and cautiously looked inside. The cabin was empty, at least of any living souls. It was cluttered with ancient furniture, cloaked in layers of dust and cobwebs. But in one corner, something caught my eye and sent a chill through me. A heap of bones lay scattered across the floor, as if a violent scene had unfolded there. On the wall, in what appeared to be dried blood, were the chilling words, "They're watching." I instinctively stepped back, a shiver racing down my spine as the sensation of being observed enveloped me. Tom finally managed to speak, his voice shaky as he insisted. We needed to get out, that something was terribly wrong. We didn't hesitate. We turned and bolted back toward the trail, seeking refuge. Yet, the forest felt different now. The trees loomed closer, the mist thickened, and the sun had vanished behind the mountains, casting long, unsettling shadows. Then, a voice echoed around us, pleading, "Help me! Please! Help!" But it wasn't just one voice. It was a multitude, perhaps dozens, all crying out in desperation, their pleas merging into a terrifying symphony. My legs felt heavy as I sprinted, my breaths coming in frantic, shallow gasps. The path had disappeared. Somehow, we had completely lost our way despite retracing our steps along the same route. Every direction seemed indistinguishable, an endless expanse of trees, a thick fog enveloping us, and an unsettling silence that was only interrupted by distant whispers. Panic surged within me. That's when we noticed a figure. Just ahead, shrouded in mist, stood a tall, shadowy silhouette. Its features were obscured, but it was clearly observing us. My heart raced as it began to approach, moving with slow, purposeful strides. I could sense my friend's fear as we all stood frozen, torn between fleeing and confronting this unknown entity. But before we could decide, the figure simply vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it had disappeared, leaving only the mist and those haunting whispers behind. We took off running, faster and harder than I ever thought possible, pushing through the burning in my legs and the sharp ache in my lungs. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until at last, we burst out of the woods and onto the trail. The voices fell silent. The quiet returned, but it was a different kind of quiet than what we had known before. This time it felt more ominous, more oppressive, as if something sinister had trailed us out. We didn't pause until we reached the car, and during the ride home, not a single word was exchanged. The gravity of our experience hung heavily in the air. After that day, the incident was never mentioned again. Tommy moved away a few months later, and gradually, the rest of us went our separate ways. Yet, Black Hollow Mountain lingers in my thoughts. I can't shake the unsettling feeling that we were not truly alone that day, that something ancient and malevolent was observing us. One thing is certain, I have no intention of returning.